Hi, I am Paul Peterson.
And I'm Andrew Malaris. In this first part, we discuss the Supreme Court's historical decision in the desegregation case, Brown v. Board of Education. Paul, where does the story of this case begin?
Well, it begins with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed right after the Civil War. It's a very important amendment. And the most important phrase in it is called the Equal Protection Clause. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
What do these words mean exactly?
No one actually knows until the Supreme Court decides. Anything that's in the Constitution, and this particular clause in the Constitution has been given many different meanings over the course of time by the Supreme Court. The court interpreted these words for the first time in 1883 in a series of cases known as the Civil Rights cases. It drew a clear distinction between state action and private action.
Could you explain this distinction?
The court said that the Equal Protection Clause only placed limits on the racial discrimination by governments. Private individuals could continue to discriminate if they pleased. Someone who ran a hotel or a restaurant or a retail store could decide not to sell to black customers if they wanted to. What these private individuals did was not state action. It was action only by government that was forbidden by the Equal Protection Clause.
But the Equal Protection Clause still applied to governments and state governments. Didn't that mean that segregation in public schools was still unconstitutional?
Well, you would think so, but in the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case decided in 1896, the court came up with the doctrine of separate but equal. As long as the facilities were separate, they could be constitutional as long as they were equal. So it involved a railroad in Louisiana, and the Louisiana government ran the railroad, so it was clearly a case of state action. But they had separate waiting rooms and separate facilities for blacks and whites. But if they were of equal quality, even though they were separate, they were constitutional.
Was the court unanimous in Plessy?
There's one great dissent that was filed by Justice John Marshall Harlan, who said, our Constitution is colorblind. He said that any time a state makes a distinction on the basis of race, it is violating the Equal Protection Clause.
And how can a decision about Louisiana railroads in 1893 be so important?
Well, it's the old principle of stare decisis, which comes up again and again. Stare decisis, stable decisions. The Supreme Court never wants to contradict itself. It says the law is the law. Whatever is decided, it's going to stay that way until it's reversed. And the court does not want to reverse a decision.
How did the court finally violate stare decisis and overturn Plessy?
Well, in the Brown decision, it does begin to do so, but that's a long political story. Much of the credit for reversing Plessy goes to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or we call it the NAACP, which was organized in 1909. It decided that political opposition to racial equality was deeply entrenched in Congress. The Southerners are very strong on Capitol Hill, and even the president was sympathetic to the South because he had to win those southern states. So they said the only way we're going to be able to reverse this court decision is by working assiduously, case after case, throughout decade after decade in order to get the courts to rethink this case. But that didn't really work that well because the courts kept dodging the issue one way or another. And eventually it was other political and social developments which really caused the change.
What were some of these developments?
The most important was the steady migration of African Americans from the southern part of the United States to the northern part of the United States. In the South, blacks could not vote. In the North, they could. So even though they came in as workers in factories and in other service jobs and weren't making much money, the machine politicians in the North said, look, here are some live bodies that we can vote, and we will take advantage of that opportunity. So pretty soon African Americans became a political force.
When did blacks begin to exercise significant political power?
The key event is 1948. In 1948, President Truman, seeking to become president in his own right, he had become president simply because he was vice president when President Roosevelt died in 1945, and he wasn't a very popular president. He had his party falling apart. Henry Wallace, a progressive, was challenging him from the left, and on the right, Strom Thurmond, a Dixiecrat, was gathering a lot of support in the southern states because there was a lot of suspicion of Truman's pro-civil rights policies. So Truman had to do something. He had to get the black vote, and the black vote was historically Republican, so it wasn't going to be that easy to get. Blacks voted for the party that freed them, which was Abraham Lincoln's party. So what happens is that he decides to desegregate the armed forces of the United States. Now, even in World War II, the armed forces were segregated. There were black soldiers, but they were fighting in their own units. Ever since the Civil War, that's the way it had been done. But Harry Truman brought that to an end, despite the fact that the Army said, oh, we can't have the armed forces integrated. It will weaken the fighting capacity of the armies. But Truman took them on, and that was a pretty dramatic event, and it led to a lot of support for Truman that manifested itself in the 1948 election.
Did it work? Did he win?
Well, you know, it was a very close election. You know, actually, when the election night came out, one newspaper said, Dewey beats Truman. And he won mainly because he took a few industrial states, some big states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York. And many people said the black vote was the critical vote that decided the election. Now, when an election's that close, a lot of things can be said to be decisive. So we can't be sure that it was exactly that caused the outcome of the election. But nonetheless, it showed that blacks had political power at a level they never had had before.
And how did Truman's victory affect the Supreme Court and the Brown decision?
Well, there's no direct connection. It actually happens in the next election, 1952. The Republicans win that. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the Republican candidate. But he wants to get that black vote back. He wants to win African votes back from the Democratic Party. The Republicans still have a chance. Furthermore, he wants to be nominated by the Republican Party at the convention, and he doesn't have quite enough votes. So he makes a deal. He makes a deal with Earl Warren, the governor of California, who wanted to be president himself, but he was running third, and so the two of them got together, and Eisenhower allegedly promises to Warren that he will make him a justice of the Supreme Court, maybe even the Supreme Court Chief Justice, if he will cast his votes for Eisenhower at the convention. So a little deal leads to Warren becoming the Chief Justice of the United States in 1953, and in 1954 we get the Brown decision. And the Brown decision is really hard to understand apart from Warren's presence on the Supreme Court.
How did Warren's presence affect the Brown decision?
Well, he was a politician. He was the governor. He had been the attorney general before he was the governor. So he knew the law, but he also knew politics. And there's a lot of politics in overturning a decision that's been a stable, stare decisis part of the constitutional interpretation of the Supreme Court for a very long period of time. And there were two Southerners on the court who kept reminding Warren of this fact. So Warren had to do something to get them on board because it was going to be very difficult to implement this decision, and he wanted a unanimous Supreme Court. How is he going to get those two Southerners to vote?
Was he able to get them to vote with him? Was he able to get unanimity?
He did. So it's a pretty amazing, and the way he did it was to distinguish the Brown decision from the old Plessy decision. He doesn't directly overturn Plessy. He says, look, that's a train decision. This is a school case. And in the case of schools, separate but equal doesn't make any sense, because if children go to separate schools, black children will acquire a sense of inferiority. Therefore, separate schools are inherently unequal, and schools must be desegregated. He didn't say anything about segregation on trains. He distinguished schools from trains. Now, specifically, if you read his opinion, you can see to separate others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that it may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Now, that phrasing has been questioned since the decision. It sounds like psychology rather than law. One would have liked to have said, as Harlan did many years earlier, the Constitution is colorblind. But Warren's reasoning was successful in getting those 2 Southern votes because he was able to hand down this decision without directly overturning Plessy.
Did Warren have to make any other compromises to get unanimity?
He actually decided that the best way to do it would be to say, we're not going to implement this overnight. We're going to have this with all deliberate speed. And it took a very long time to implement the decision. And that was in part due to the fact that they wrote right into the decision that we shall have deliberate speed. Well, we got a lot more deliberation than we got speed. So we're going to take a close look at the reaction to Brown in part 2 of this lecture.